Greetings, church family. Listen, I hope you feel the same way about me. But I don't mind telling you, it does my heart good to see all of you whenever we get together. It would crush me if I discovered that any of you would rather I not be here. I know you'd feel the same way if you felt you weren't wanted for some reason. So it's easy to get caught up into our own feelings and not consider that everyone around us may also be fighting a hard battle in life. That's why I keep reminding everyone that we need to encourage one another and not simply assume someone is doing all right. They may not be. So I want to encourage you to encourage one another. It should help to know that by doing so, it lifts you up as well. I know I'll never turn down a kind word or try to talk you out of speaking one. Everyone needs it, including the leadership. And while you're at it, don't forget the preacher. If you will, please join me at this time in reading from our passage found in Luke chapter 9, verses 51 through 56. When the days drew near for him to be taken up, he set his face to go to Jerusalem. And he sent messengers ahead of him, who went and entered a village of the Samaritans to make preparations for him. But the people did not receive him, because his face was set toward Jerusalem. And when his disciples, James and John, saw it, they said, "Lord, do you want us to tell fire to come down from heaven and consume them?" But he turned and rebuked them. And they went on to another village. There are a few experiences in life more painful and more tragic than rejection. If we all sat down and compiled our own individual lists of our greatest fears, right at the top of everyone's list will be some version of fear of failure and fear of rejection, followed by the usual suspects, the phobias: fear of public speaking, fear of heights, fear of flying, fear of the dark, fear of strangers, and so forth, including the increasingly common fear of getting a disease, or germophobia. The list of phobias is quite long and growing, and having one or more of these has a direct, usually negative impact on how we evaluate life and on how we make decisions. But there's no doubt that fear of failure and rejection will be very near the top of the list for just about everyone. Rejection, though, appears to be the most impactful. You could argue that the fear of failure hinges on the prospect of being rejected. That is, we fear rejection precisely because it means failure in some aspect of our decisions or activities. On the other hand, rejection is secondary to failure. In other words, failure doesn't necessarily lead to rejection, but rejection is almost always associated with some type of failure. You could try and try over and over again to master a difficult task, but fail. People might still cheer you on until you make it. Rejection may not be connected to your failure at all. Well, Army Ranger School is a good example. It's very tough to get into. Most soldiers who try fail. So, if you're fortunate enough to be selected and end up graduating, wearing the Ranger tab on your shoulder is a symbol of prestige and accomplishment. However, just having been selected and showing up for training carries its own prestige. What's curious is no one who flunks out of Ranger School is ashamed of it. because everyone knows how tough it is just to qualify for entrance into the program. And by virtue of the fact that you were selected to begin with, singles you out as a cut above the rest. Well, that's not true of many other specialty trainings, like jump school, where you learn to jump out of a perfectly good airplane at 2,000 feet. Or air assault school, where you learn to shimmy down a rope from a helicopter hovering 75 to 150 feet above the ground. But for Ranger School, all you have to do is show up and try, and you're the bomb. Failure? Maybe. But no one rejects you for it. There's no rejection from others for failing Ranger School. You're still a high-speed, low-drag hero. Rejection is painful. Researchers tell us that rejection shows up on an MRI in the same areas of the brain where we feel physical pain. So if you describe rejection as a kick in the gut or a knife in your back, you're not too far off. It's emotionally and physically painful and can be psychologically damaging if it's allowed to fester. Chronic feelings of rejection and a high sensitivity to rejection are major contributors to depression, a sense of doom, feelings of loneliness and isolation. It can lead to anxiety in social interactions and can eventually manifest in any number of personality disorders or even mental illness, such as avoidant personality or borderline personality disorder. Fortunately, most of the time, we don't experience rejection or its consequences on an extreme level like that. But we shouldn't underestimate it either. It's powerful. Just the fear of rejection is as debilitating as actually being rejected. For most things that we fear, the fear itself is often worse than the thing that we're actually afraid of. But rejection is different. It's very difficult to separate the impact of rejection from the fear of it. Both hurt a lot. They feel the same and usually generate the same reaction. It's arguably the single greatest precipitating factor that can send us on a downward spiral of feeling like a failure, self-loathing, resentment, anger. It can lead us to see or imagine the worst in others and provides a strong motivation to retaliate and punish those that we perceive to have rejected us. Just think about this. Think about all the workplace shootings, going postal, school shootings. The perpetrator was often bullied or fired, which is another way of saying they perceived they were rejected in some unfair, unjust way that they believed in the moment couldn't be made right without violent retaliation. Rejection is not your friend. A very mild way of describing rejection is to talk about not being accepted. It's the same thing, but not as harsh. It might be what we call a distinction without a difference. Not being accepted leaves the door open for another opportunity. It's not yes, but it's not no either. Not being accepted can mean not at this time or try later. But because it's not yes, it can feel just like rejection. Have you ever taken advantage of an open invitation to participate in something, like a group, an activity, or an organization, like an open invitation to go to church? And you show up, make an effort to fit in, to connect, only to end up walking away out of frustration. You probably won't go back or try again because now your expectations are confirmed by reality. They don't really want you, in spite of what they may have advertised to get you there. You came looking for signs of acceptance, openness, inclusion, genuine concern, a sincere interest in you. But instead you saw signs of exclusion, closed relationships, indifference, tone deafness, and so on. Those on the inside are the least likely to see it in themselves. Many people won't believe it, and few would admit it, even if you showed them all the evidence that they're being like that. You want to hear a shocker? To some degree or another, I just described most churches. I'm talking about God's primary, number one means for reaching a lost world, for engaging and reaching and bringing in outsiders. The church. The church is actually pushing them away. It's easy to make excuses. Our world is filled with people who blatantly reject Christianity for a variety of reasons. We have no control over that. But a lot of them reject Jesus, not because of anything Jesus may have said or done, but because of what those who claim to follow him have said or done, or failed to do or say. That's something we actually do have control over, by the way. But we first have to see it, then admit it, then make every adjustment we can to fix it. It doesn't matter how many visitors walk through our doors. If their perception is non-acceptance, that is rejection, they will walk back out and are unlikely to return. If they get this kind of welcome enough times at other churches, and it won't take very many, they'll stop trying. Their opinion of us will not be very flattering, and they won't feel bad about telling others about it either. As the time for fulfillment of Jesus' mission on earth began to get closer, Jesus made a decision. That's putting it pretty lightly. It's like describing the Twin Towers going down on 9/11 by saying some people did something. It doesn't quite portray what really happened. There are some very interesting words and phrases in verses 51 through 56. Here, Luke is stressing that the time had come for a major shift, a major transition in Jesus' mission. The time had come to completely fill full the requirements of the gospel. It's the arrival of the moment of God's plan, where it becomes irreversible, irrevocable. It's the time for him to be taken up. Taken up. That word occurs in the New Testament only here. Taken up means the ascension of Jesus, either lifted up on the cross, or ascended from the grave, like raised up, resurrected, or his ascension into heaven at the conclusion of all the above. It's the beginning of the end that terminates with Jesus on the cross and ultimately ascending into heaven as King of Kings, the final phase. Jesus set his face to go to Jerusalem. It's a Hebraism that means he fully and firmly committed his absolute resolve to go to Jerusalem and complete God's overall strategic plan to suffer and die and be raised on the third day. There's no backing out, no turning back. Jesus made a rock-solid decision. He demonstrates an absolute, crystal clear intent without deviation. Jesus can no longer be swayed as if he ever could have been. He can no longer be influenced or deterred. From this point forward, it is locked in so tight that any deviation is impossible to even consider. He set his face. In our study in Luke, we finally come to what arguably is the center of gravity for the narrative overall, the continental divide, so to speak, of Luke's gospel. Something significant has taken place. As with the Transfiguration, it's difficult to pass this off merely as a general factual statement. If things weren't serious before, they are now. God determined the times and events and fixed the path. Jesus fixes his resolve to embrace that path all the way. For the first time in a long time, we're dealing with material unique to Luke. None of the other Gospels deal with Jesus' rejection at Samaria. Just as much of the material in Luke chapter 4 concerning Jesus' rejection at Nazareth is also unique to Luke, so here it is unique as well. The material in chapter 4 kicks off Jesus' preaching and teaching and healing mission. Our passage kicks off Jesus' final teaching mission with very few miracles and healings from this point forward. We are right on the heels of the disciples arguing over which of them is the greatest, which seems petty if you think about it. Jesus is embarking on a mission of absolute selfless service. In fact, his identity, who he is so wrapped up into God's plan, so consumed in his ministry of redeeming the fallen creation, that his entire self is swallowed up in complete submission to the will of the Father. If he were to think about himself, even for a moment, he might balk. He might demand a different outcome. And the disciples are doing just that, thinking of themselves. Not as a group, but each is thinking only of himself and his status. What a contrast. Jesus is the last person on Jesus' mind, behind even his self-interested disciples. From where they are, the only way to get to Jerusalem is to travel through Samaria. And Jesus faces opposition right off the bat. Such treatment might have taken the wind out of the sails of a lesser man. Jesus, of course, fails to match our expectations of lesser men. He sends messengers ahead to make preparations, much like he'll do later when he's about to make his triumphal entry into Jerusalem and before the Last Supper. But Jesus is not accepted. No, he is rejected. They will not receive him. This is an interesting choice of words. When the disciples were arguing about who was the greatest, in verses 46 to 48, Jesus talked to them about being received. Whoever receives this child in my name, he said, receives me. And whoever receives me, or receives him who sent me. For he who is least among you all is the one who is great. Apparently the Samaritans didn't get the memo. Before we come down too hard on them, and it'd be pretty easy to judge them, it's important to remember there has been a long-standing animosity between Jews and their half-Jew, half-Gentile cousins. This hostility was normal, typical. The Samaritans came about during the Babylonian captivity, when the few remaining Jews intermarried with Gentiles and basically created a half-Jew, half-Gentile race known as Samaritans. Gentiles were seen by the Jews as being higher on the acceptability scale than Samaritans. In fact, the Jews typically saw themselves at the top, with Gentiles next in importance, followed by dogs, and then Samaritans. The Samaritans resented the Jews for this and for other reasons. Should they have made an exception for Jesus? Maybe. If they knew more about him, but they would not have been among the Jewish crowds following Jesus, hearing him teach and preach, and witnessing the miracles. So far, there haven't been any miracles involving Samaritans. though that will change soon. The fact that Jesus' face was set to go to Jerusalem didn't help much either. That was the reason given for rejecting him. Still, it's pretty insulting to go to them in good faith, asking for accommodations, only to end up talking to the hand. So, two of Jesus' special picks, James and John, feeling justifiably indignant, make what appears to be a reasonable suggestion. Let's burn them to a crisp. That'll teach them a lesson. They won't soon forget that. They asked Jesus, as if they had any power at all, if he wants them to call down fire from heaven to consume them. Call down. That means to move downward, to climb downward, roll down. It's the same word used to describe the sweat on Jesus' face that rolled down like drops, great drops of blood in the Garden of Gethsemane. The word for consume means to completely destroy, to annihilate something. Apparently, this is their interpretation of Jesus telling them to shake off the dust from your feet if anyone failed to receive them in chapter 9, verse 4. There's a clear allusion to Elijah in 2 Kings 1 implied here. Elijah called down fire to consume the captain and 50 soldiers. An incident that served to establish that Elijah was indeed a man of God. Perhaps they felt the Samaritans would get the reference and change their minds. But rather than rubber stamping the disciples' suggestion, Jesus turns and rebukes them. It's interesting that Jesus isn't quoted as saying anything in this passage. Luke just says he sent messengers to make arrangements in verse 55, and he rebukes the disciples. But Luke doesn't record Jesus' exact words. The word rebuke means Jesus strongly disapproved of their suggestion to bring down fire. Wow. What an unusual encounter. We know how Jesus felt about it, sort of. I'm sure he was less than pleased that the Samaritans essentially told him to go pound sand. But he doesn't meet the insult with indignation or retribution. They simply go on their way to another village. It's not clear if it's another village in Samaria or beyond, where people might be more hospitable, but Jesus harbors no animosity toward them. In fact, he will later heal 10 lepers, at least one of whom is a Samaritan in chapter 17. He also holds the Samaritan up as a shining example of love your neighbor as yourself, in what we call the parable of the Good Samaritan in chapter 10. But what should we make of it? This message this morning is part 1 of 2. Next week, we'll look at Jesus on the road again, part 2. But we're not there yet. Where are we? You know, it's surprising how many articles you can Google that talk about rejection. Many have titles like 6 steps you can take when you don't feel welcomed at work, or 5 things you should do when you don't feel welcomed. There are many more. Some items on all the lists, some things they have in common to help you avoid rejection, are things like reach out for help, come out of your shell, listen as much as you talk, and so on. But the one thing that seems to be on every list at the end is some version of be willing to leave, be willing to find another job, another group, another church. Ultimately, the few options you have to overcome rejection fail. And they very well could. If that happens, Leave. Move on. And among the most important things you can do for a visitor to help a visitor not feel rejected is acknowledge their presence and engage them with a genuine interest in who they are and what led them to visit. The second most important is to follow up and call, email, or visit them if they leave contact information. It really is that simple. I admit a fear of failure and fear of rejection definitely make the top of my list. I know I'm not alone. I've had times in my life where being rejected was debilitating. It completely shut me down. Fear of rejection makes it very hard to take risks. But not taking risks, especially not risking failure, can shut down and prevent success in anything. I can't imagine anything more painful than rejection from other people. The more significant the person is to you who rejects you, the more painful it is. So, can you imagine the excruciating pain of being rejected by God? Getting our minds around this helps us understand the degree of anger Cain felt when his brother Abel's offering was accepted by God, but his own offering was rejected. It helps us identify with James and John. Rejection made them angry enough to want to burn a village to a crisp. If we know by experience what it's like, we can have empathy for those who end up not being accepted. If we know by experience what it's like to be rejected, then how can we bring ourselves to identify with the Samaritans? They rejected Jesus, the real Jesus. I have a simple but very important question to ask you. Where is your transition? Where is the point where you say to yourself, I get it. I see it now like never before. I see the real Jesus. I can hear what he's saying. And then cross that point of no return. If you see it and have come right up to it, you must cross over. If you're not there, why not? What obstacle or obstacles can be so important to you to make you so determined to follow Jesus from a comfortable distance? Listen, folks. I don't know what your expectations were when you brought me here. Maybe you were against it all along, and so maybe you feel justified tuning me out. Maybe you feel there's been some kind of bait and switch, and I'm talking to the hand. I have never, nor will I ever, simply toe the party line and surrender my voice to preach nice, safe, feel-good sermons. It's not in my DNA. Not happening. If the passage feels good, then feel good. But I'm here to preach the word. I'm here to join with you in the journey to discover the real Jesus, to understand what he asks of us, and speak to the best of my fallible ability to what I see. If it confirms what we already know, then hallelujah. If it opens up a clearer path and challenges and convicts you, so be it. I intend to say what God wants you to hear and do my best to get out of his way so he can work in you to will and work and serve him. And what I have to say here this morning is a question. What is your determination? Where is your transition from self-interest to self-denial? Jesus set his face to accomplish his mission, his purpose. He came right up to and boldly, confidently crossed over past the point of no return. He resolutely, firmly fixed his resolve to go to Jerusalem, to bear his cross, to die, to be raised from the dead, and to ascend to heaven and sit on the throne of absolute, never-ending power. That's the gospel, church. If anyone would come after him, let him follow suit on the same path. Let her follow the same path with the same determination. Discipleship is putting away all the things that are preventing you from setting your face to follow a Jesus who set his face to die for you. This isn't over, not by any stretch of your imagination. Part 2 of this is coming. Are you rejecting Jesus? I advise everyone listening to this message to take note. If we're receiving Jesus as he outlines in his gospel in Luke, denying yourself, taking up your cross daily, and receiving him like we would receive a child, what can we expect from Jesus if we're doing that? Will he not accept us? And if we reject him, what will his response be? Will fire roll down from heaven? That's what it comes down to. It's what it always comes down to. Some choices really are binary choices. Either A or B. Receive or reject Jesus. What if you're only denying some of yourself, but maintaining power and control over other parts of your life, and making sure the two never mix? What if the way you treat one another is falling short of the simple imperatives to love one another with a pure heart? What if loving your neighbor is secondary to loving yourself? And how do you treat your brother and sister in Christ when you don't agree? It's hard to love someone when you don't like them. Don't you want to be forgiven? Why won't you forgive? Why would you reject instead? When visitors come in, what do they see? Is there evidence of their being received with the love of Christ? Do they feel welcome? Or are there subtle signs that they don't belong? How hard should they have to work to fit in? If we have trouble receiving people, how do you think we're doing receiving Jesus? Will he rebuke us? Will he simply move on to another town, another church? Jesus, his face is still set toward Jerusalem, the new Jerusalem, when all this is over with. We are called to set our faces to follow him all the way. If we are to follow Jesus, then we must embrace his path, the path that leads to rejection by the world, but acceptance by God. Will you bow with me? Righteous Father, thank you, Lord, so much for the conviction of your word. May we all be convicted in our hearts to comprehend how significant and foundational all this is. To put ourselves last, deny ourselves, and to resolutely set our faces to follow Jesus on the same path. Father, to do what he says all the way to the very end. Help us, Father, to find within ourselves this willingness, the strength to deny ourselves and fully embrace Jesus. This is our prayer in the name of your Son, Jesus. Amen.